The date is January 17th, 1809. The time is just before dawn. The setting is the ramparts of the citadel of Corunna, a port city on the jagged northwestern tip of Spain. The air is thick with the smell of salt spray, wet wool, and the lingering acrid stench of black powder. In the grey, miserable light of a winter morning, a small group of officers gathers in silence. They are exhausted, their uniforms stained with the mud of a 300-mile retreat and the blood of a desperate battle fought only hours before. They are not digging a foundation for a monument. They are digging a hole with their swords because there are no spades to be found. Into this shallow earth, wrapped only in his military cloak, they lower the body of Lieutenant General Sir John Moore. There is no coffin. There is no 21-gun salute. The only funeral music is the distant boom of French artillery, slowly finding the range of the British transport ships in the harbour. The hurried nature of this burial, immortalised later in poetry, paints a picture of utter defeat. To a casual observer, this scene marks the end of Britain's hopes in the Peninsular War. The British Army is fleeing the continent, driven into the sea by the relentless momentum of Napoleon Bonaparte. The commander is dead. The expedition is a failure. But history is rarely so simple. As the earth was kicked over John Moore's body, the officers standing over him knew they were burying more than just a man. They were burying the architect of a revolution. Sir John Moore is often remembered as a tragic figure, a footnote in the saga of the Napoleonic Wars, who served merely as a prelude to the Duke of Wellington. This view is a profound misunderstanding of military evolution. Wellington, the Iron Duke, would go on to defeat Napoleon, but he would do so using the weapon that John Moore had forged. To understand the magnitude of Moore's contribution, we must look at the state of the British Army before him. In the late 18th century, the British soldier was viewed by his own government not as a professional warrior, but as a necessary evil. The ranks were filled with the desperate, the criminal, and the destitute, pressed into service by gin or the magistrate's gavel. The discipline was draconian. Flogging was the universal solution to every infraction, from a dirty button to insubordination. The tactical doctrine was rigid, mechanical, and mindless. Soldiers were trained to be automata, marching in straight lines, firing volleys on command, and dying in place. Individual thought was not just discouraged, it was considered dangerous. This system, modelled on the Prussian army of Frederick the Great, worked well enough in the predictable chess matches of the mid-18th century. But the world had changed. The French Revolution had unleashed a new kind of warfare, fast, aggressive, and driven by mass citizen armies who fought with a patriotic fervour that mercenaries could not match. Napoleon Bonaparte had taken this raw energy and refined it into a thunderbolt. His columns moved with terrifying speed, screened by swarms of skirmishers who picked off the rigid enemy lines before the main blow ever landed. By 1800, the old monarchies of Europe were crumbling. Their robotic armies were being smashed apart by the fluid, dynamic warfare of the French. Britain was facing an existential crisis. It had the world's greatest navy, but its army was a laughingstock, mocked by friends and enemies alike. It was into this vacuum of competence that John Moore stepped. He was a man out of time, a humanitarian in an age of brutality, a professional in an age of amateurs, and a visionary who saw that the only way to defeat the French was not to copy them, but to evolve beyond them. Moore did not just want to drill men, he wanted to craft a new type of soldier. He envisioned a warrior who was self-reliant, intelligent, and physically fit. A soldier who could fight alone or in a pair, who could read the terrain, and who obeyed orders not out of fear of the lash, but out of respect for his officers and pride in his regiment. The tragedy of Corunna is not that Moore died. The tragedy is that his death obscured his life's work. The retreat to the sea was a harrowing disaster, yes, but the army that survived it was the kernel of the force that would eventually march into Paris. The burial on the ramparts was not an end, but a beginning. The man in the shallow grave had already planted the seeds of victory. seeds that would blossom on the killing fields of Salamanca, Vittoria, and Waterloo. To understand how Britain went from a military joke to the conqueror of Napoleon, we must look at the life of the man who taught the British soldier how to comprehend the revolution John Moore would later lead. We must first understand the fires that forged him. Moore was born in Glasgow in 1761, the son of a doctor and a tutor to nobility. This upbringing is significant. He was not born into the idle aristocracy that treated military commissions as social clubs. He was educated, travelled, and possessed a sharp, inquisitive intellect. When he entered the army at the tender age of 15, he did not bring with him the arrogance of the landed gentry, but the curiosity of a scholar. His classroom was not a parade ground in peaceful England, but the chaotic forests of North America. As a junior officer during the American Revolutionary War, Moore witnessed the humiliation of the British military machine. He watched as the finest heavy infantry in the world, trained to fight in open fields, were picked apart by American rebels hiding behind trees and stone walls. He saw the futility of the rigid line against a flexible, intelligent enemy. While many of his peers dismissed the Americans as ungentlemanly savages, Moore saw the future. He realized that the terrain of war was changing. The days of flat, open battlefields were ending. The future would be fought in woods, in towns, and in broken country where the mechanical volley was useless. But Moore learned something else in America, something even more radical than tactics. He learned the value of the common soldier. In the isolation of the colonies, cut off from the pomp of London, the rigid barriers between officer and man began to blur. Moore observed that when treated with dignity, the British soldier was capable of immense resilience. When he returned to Europe, he carried with him a dangerous idea, that a soldier fought better when he was led by example rather than driven by fear. This philosophy was put to a brutal test in 1798 during the Irish Rebellion. It was a vicious sectarian civil war characterized by atrocities on both sides. The British response was often one of indiscriminate terror, with militia units burning villages and flogging suspects without trial. Moore, now a general, was appalled. He famously noted that the discipline of the British forces was so bad they were formidable to everyone but the enemy. In an era when generals were expected to crush dissent with an iron fist, Moore showed restraint. He forbade looting and punished soldiers who abused civilians. He proved that an army could be disciplined without being cruel, and that moral authority was a commander's greatest asset. However, a humanitarian general is of no use if he cannot win battles. Moore's critics, and there were many in the political establishment who found his ideas soft, questioned whether his enlightened approach could stand up to the French. The answer came in 1801 on the sands of Egypt. During the Battle of Alexandria, Moore commanded the reserve. In the pre-dawn darkness, the French launched a surprise attack, their columns smashing into the British positions. In the confusion, the 28th Regiment of Foot found themselves surrounded, with French cavalry charging their rear and French infantry pressing their front. In standard doctrine, this was a death sentence. The unit should have panicked and routed. But Moore was there, in the thick of the fighting. He did not panic. He rode amongst the men, his voice cutting through the din. He gave the famous order. "Rear rank, 28th, right about face." The regiment did the impossible. The rear rank turned around and fought the cavalry behind them, while the front rank continued to fire forward. They fought back to back, a living island of redcoats in a sea of blue. Moore was wounded in the leg, but he refused to leave the field until the French were broken. The 28th won the right to wear their regimental badge on both the front and back of their caps, a unique honour. But the real victor was Moore's reputation. He had proven that he was not just a theorist or a moralist. He was a fighter of the highest order. By 1803, Sir John Moore was arguably the most respected soldier in the British Army. He was 41 years old, in the prime of his life, physically fit and professionally unmatched. But the greatest challenge was just arriving. Across the English Channel at the camp of Boulogne, Napoleon Bonaparte was gathering the Army of England. A massive invasion force was preparing to cross the water. Britain needed a miracle. They needed an army that could match the French speed and skill. The Duke of York, the commander-in-chief, turned to Moore. He gave him a camp at Shorncliffe on the Kentish coast and a handful of regiments. His orders were simple. Take these men and create an answer. Shorncliffe camp, situated on the high cliffs of Kent, was not just a military base, it was a laboratory. Every clear day, the soldiers stationed there could look across the English Channel and imagine the glint of French bayonets gathering at Boulogne. The threat of invasion was visceral and immediate. It was here, under the shadow of imminent destruction, that John Moore began the experiment that would change warfare forever. He was given command of a specific brigade, the 43rd and 52nd Regiments of Foot, and the newly formed 95th Rifles. These men would become the test subjects for the Shorncliffe system. To the casual observer, the changes Moore implemented might have seemed subtle, but to the military mind, they were revolutionary heresy. The first thing Moore discarded was the doctrine of stupidity. For 100 years, European armies had operated on the principle that a soldier should be a machine. His job was to stand in a line, load his musket in 12 distinct movements, and fire into the smoke until he was killed. Independent thought was considered a precursor to mutiny. Moore reversed this. He argued that in the broken terrain of modern war, a soldier needed to be an intelligent agent. He introduced the concept of the skirmisher troops, who deployed in loose order ahead of the main line, using trees, rocks, and folds in the ground for cover. To make this work, Moore reinvented the social structure of the regiment. He broke the monolithic line down into small, cohesive units. He introduced the concept of comrades, grouping men into pairs. These file partners lived together, ate together, and fought together. On the battlefield, if one man moved, the other covered him. If one was wounded, the other protected him. This created a molecular bond of loyalty that was far stronger than the fear of a sergeant's cane. The training was relentless, but it was practical. While other regiments spent hours polishing buttons and powdering wigs, Moore's men spent their days marching, shooting, and swimming. He realized that speed was a weapon. The standard British march was a ponderous 75 paces per minute. Moore trained his light infantry to move at the quick step, 140 paces per minute. This allowed his units to redeploy, flank, and maneuver with a fluidity that bewildered observers. They could transition from a marching column to a firing line and back again in seconds, flowing over the landscape like water rather than trudging like cattle. Crucially, Moore changed the culture of the officers. In the regular army, officers were often distant aristocrats who viewed their men as livestock. Moore insisted that his officers be professionals. He required them to learn the drill alongside the men, to understand the weight of a pack and the bite of a blister. He encouraged them to treat the enlisted men with respect. The officers must lead by example, he wrote, and they must know their duty better than the men they command. This fostered a unique esprit de corps in the light division. The soldiers didn't just obey their officers, they trusted them. The 95th Rifles were the crowning jewel of this system. Clad in dark green rather than the traditional scarlet, they were the first British unit equipped with the Baker rifle. Unlike the smoothbore musket, which was lucky to hit a barn door at 100 yards, the Baker was a precision instrument. Moore trained the 95th to be hunters. They were taught to pick their targets, prioritizing enemy officers, drummers, and sergeants. This was considered unsporting by the old guard, who viewed war as a gentleman's exchange of volleys. Moore didn't care about sportsmanship. He cared about effectiveness. He was creating the modern sniper. By 1805, the threat of invasion had passed. Nelson's victory at Trafalgar had secured the seas, but the weapon Moore had forged at Shorncliffe was ready. The Light Division was no longer just an experiment. It was the sharpest blade in the British arsenal. They were fit, fast, intelligent, and deadly. But a weapon is useless without a hand to wield it, and a war to fight. In 1808, destiny called. Napoleon had invaded Spain and Portugal, and Britain decided to send an army to the peninsula. Sir John Moore was given command of the British forces in Portugal. He arrived to find a chaotic political situation, difficult allies, and the looming shadow of the French Empire. He had his army, the men he had trained, the men he loved. But he was about to face a strategic nightmare that would test his thinking soldiers to their absolute limit. The laboratory was closed. The real war had begun. The autumn of 1808 was a season of delusion. In London, politicians and the public were drunk on optimism. The Spanish people had risen up against French occupation, and the newspapers were filled with romantic tales of peasant armies defeating Napoleon's legions. The British government, eager for a foothold on the continent, ordered Sir John Moore to march his army of 20,000 men from Portugal into the heart of Spain to cooperate with these victorious Spanish forces. They promised him 30,000 Spanish soldiers would be waiting to join him. They promised supplies, transport, and enthusiastic local support. It was all a lie. As Moore crossed the border into Spain in November, the reality on the ground shattered the fantasies of Whitehall. The victorious Spanish armies had not just been defeated, they had been annihilated. Napoleon Bonaparte, frustrated by the Spanish uprising, had personally led the Grande Armée across the Pyrenees to restore order. This was not a marshal's war. The emperor himself was in command. He moved with the terrifying speed that defined his genius, smashing the Spanish resistance at Burgos, Espinosa, and Tudela. The 30,000 allies Moore had been promised were ghosts. The supplies never materialized. The British army was marching into a vacuum. Moore was now in a position that would have paralyzed a lesser commander. He was deep in enemy territory, vastly outnumbered, with no support and winter closing in. His intelligence reports were terrifying. Napoleon was in Madrid with 80,000 men, and other French corps were sweeping through the country. The logical military decision, the safe decision, was to turn around immediately, retreat to the safety of Portugal, and preserve the army. His generals advised it. The politicians would have understood it. But Sir John Moore was not just a soldier, he was a strategist. He realized that while Napoleon was busy conquering the south of Spain, the French lines of communication to France were stretched thin, running north through the city of Burgos. If Moore struck at those lines, he could sever the artery of the French army. Then, a stroke of luck changed history. A British patrol intercepted a French courier carrying a dispatch from Marshal Berthier to Napoleon. The letter revealed two crucial facts. First, the French were completely unaware of where the British army was, and second, Marshal Soult was isolated in the north with a vulnerable corps. Moore saw his chance. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. Instead of retreating to safety, he decided to advance deeper into the danger zone. He would march north and attack Soult. He knew he could not defeat the entire French army, but he understood the psychology of his enemy. He knew that the moment he threatened the French communications, Napoleon would be forced to abandon his conquest of the south and turn to deal with him. Moore was using his small army as bait. He was deliberately putting his head into the lion's mouth to save his Spanish allies. "I shall do what I can," Moore wrote in his final dispatch to London, "to create a diversion." It was a masterpiece of understatement. On December 21st, the British light cavalry, the vanguard of Moore's force, smashed into the French cavalry at Sahagun. The victory was sharp and brilliant, but its strategic impact was nuclear. When news reached Napoleon that the English were near his supply lines, he was incredulous. Then he was furious. "Moore is the only general fit to contend with me," he reportedly said. "I shall advance against him in person." The bait had been taken. Napoleon immediately halted his invasion of southern Spain. He abandoned his plans to march on Lisbon. He spun his entire massive war machine, 80,000 veteran troops, the Imperial Guard, and the best cavalry in Europe around to the north. His goal was no longer conquest, it was annihilation. He intended to surround Moore, cut him off from the sea, and crush the British army out of existence. Moore had achieved his strategic goal. He had saved the south of Spain from immediate conquest, buying the Spanish patriots vital months to regroup. But the price of this success was now due. The hunters had become the hunted. On Christmas Eve 1808, realizing the sheer size of the force bearing down on him, Moore issued the order that breaks a soldier's heart. Retreat! The trap was closing. To the north lay the freezing mountains of Galicia. To the south lay Napoleon. The only hope was a desperate race of 250 miles to the port of Corunna, where the Royal Navy might, if the winds were kind, be waiting to rescue them. The Great Retreat had begun. The retreat to Corunna is one of the darkest chapters in British military history. It was a race against death through the freezing mountains of Galicia, played out in the depths of winter. As the army turned its back on the enemy and began the long trudge to the sea, the bonds of discipline, brittle in the best of times, snapped. For the common soldier, a retreat is psychologically devastating. An advance offers the promise of plunder and glory. A retreat offers only suffering. As the weather worsened, turning the roads into rivers of freezing mud, the army began to dissolve. Boots fell apart, uniforms turned to rags, and men marched with feet wrapped in raw hide or blood-soaked bandages. The supply wagons, unable to navigate the icy mountain passes, were abandoned or burned. Then came the horror of Bembibra. On reaching the town, famished and freezing soldiers discovered vast wine cellars. Discipline collapsed instantly. Thousands of men broke ranks, smashing open casks and drinking themselves into a stupor. It was a scene of Dantean madness, a mob of drunkards rioting while the French cavalry rode closer every hour. When Moore arrived, he tried to restore order, but it was too late. He was forced to make the grim decision to march the functional part of the army out, leaving the stragglers behind. As the British rearguard departed, the French dragoons swept into the town. The screams of the drunken soldiers, slashed down by sabres as they stumbled in the streets, haunted those who escaped. The retreat revealed the stark divide in the army. The regular line regiments, drilled only to obey orders in a rigid formation, fell apart when the structure was removed. They looted Spanish villages, stole food from peasants, and discarded their weapons. But amidst this disintegration, one element stood firm: the Light Division and the Reserve. Here, the value of the Shorncliffe system became undeniable. While others panicked, the men of the 95th Rifles and the Light Infantry kept their formation. They were the rearguard, the shield that protected the dying army. Day after day, they fought a rolling battle against the French vanguard. They utilized the wolf pack tactics Moore had taught them, biting at the enemy flanks, setting ambushes at bridges, and using their aimed fire to kill French officers. They were starving and exhausted, but they did not break. Their discipline came from within, from that comradeship Moore had fostered. They fought not because they were afraid of the lash, but because they refused to let their mates down. The suffering extended beyond the soldiers. Following the army was a train of wives and children, camp followers who had no official status, but were the lifeblood of the logistics. As the retreat intensified, these civilians were left behind in the snow. The roadside became a graveyard of women clutching frozen infants, unable to take another step. Moore, riding back and forth along the line, saw the human cost of his strategy. His face, usually calm, grew dark and haggard. He was saving the army, but he was losing his men's souls. By the time they reached the port of Corunna on January 11th, the army was a spectre. They had marched 250 miles in snow and rain. They were skeleton thin, their eyes hollow, their weapons rusted. They crested the final hill, desperate for the sight of the Royal Navy fleet that would carry them home. They looked out at the harbour. It was empty. The transport ships had been delayed by storms in Vigo. There was no escape. The army was trapped between the cold Atlantic Ocean and the approaching French army of Marshal Soult. Panic threatened to consume the ranks again, but Moore was at his finest in this moment of crisis. He did not despair. He turned his army around, deployed them along the ridge of Monte Mero, and issued a simple order. Stand and fight. If they could not leave, they would make the French pay for every inch of ground. On January 14th, the sails of the British transport fleet finally pierced the horizon. Cheers erupted from the haggard troops on the shore, but the relief was short-lived. Evacuating an army of 14,000 men, along with horses and artillery, takes days. Marshal Soult, watching from the heights above, knew his window was closing. He had to strike before the British slipped away. On the afternoon of January 16th, 1809, the French drums began to beat. Moore had chosen his ground carefully, but it was far from ideal. The British occupied a low ridge near the village of El Vieja. The French held the higher ground, encircling the British position like a horseshoe. Soult's plan was brutal and direct. He would use his heavy artillery to pound the British line, then launch a massive infantry assault on the British right flank. If he could break through there, he would cut the British off from the harbour and drive them into the sea. At 2 p.m, the French column surged forward. The village of El Vieja became the epicentre of the storm. It was a chaotic, close-quarters brawl through stone walls and narrow lanes. The British 50th Regiment and the 42nd Highlanders, the Black Watch, bore the brunt of the attack. Under the withering fire of French skirmishers and the pounding of the Grand Battery on the heights, the British line began to buckle. This was the moment Moore had been waiting for. He was not a general who commanded from the rear with a telescope. He was in the saddle, galloping straight into the fire zone. He rode to the 42nd, who were wavering as their ammunition ran low. His presence was electric. "Highlanders!" he shouted above the roar of the cannons. "Remember Egypt!" The effect was instantaneous. The Black Watch, reminded of their shared glory with Moore at Alexandria, rallied. They charged back into the village with bayonets fixed. Meanwhile, Moore directed the 50th Regiment to counterattack. But his tactical genius was most evident on the extreme right. He had held back a reserve force under General Paget, hidden in a valley. As the French extended their line to flank the British, Paget's men sprang the trap, hitting the French attackers in their own flank. The Shorncliffe training was paying off. The British musketry was disciplined and lethal. Instead of breaking, the Redcoats were advancing. The French assault, which was supposed to be the final hammer blow, shattered against the anvil of Moore's leadership. The British were not just surviving, they were winning. Moore watched the French line recoil with satisfaction. He had done it. He had taken a broken, starving army and turned it back into a fighting machine. He had baited Napoleon, saved the Spanish South, and now he had beaten Soult. The road to the ships was open, but victory in the Napoleonic era was often decided by stray chances. As Moore sat on his horse, watching the 42nd advance, a cannonball from the French heights screamed through the air. It struck him on the left shoulder, shattering the collarbone and shoulder blade, and tearing the arm away until it hung only by shreds of flesh and muscle. The impact threw him from his horse, slamming him into the muddy ground. He did not cry out. He sat up, his eyes fixed on the battle. When his aides rushed to him, horrified by the mangled ruin of his chest, his first words were not of pain. He pointed to the Highlanders pushing the French back. "They are advancing," he whispered. The journey from the battlefield to the rear was a slow, agonizing procession. 6 soldiers of the 42nd Highlanders and the Guards used a blanket as a makeshift stretcher to carry their dying commander. As they moved over the broken ground, Captain Harding, an aide-de-camp, noticed that the hilt of Moore's sword was banging against the raw, open wound of his shoulder. Harding reached down to unbuckle the belt and remove the weapon, hoping to spare the general some pain. But even in his delirium, Moore's instinct as a soldier remained dominant. He stopped Harding with a faint whisper. "It is as well as it is," he said. "I had rather it should go out of the field with me." He was carried into a house in Corunna, away from the roar of the guns. The scene in that room was one of profound sorrow. The most hardened officers in the army, men who had waded through blood from India to the Americas, wept openly. Moore remained lucid to the end, his mind still racing with the details of the battle. He asked repeatedly if the French were beaten, finding peace only when confirmed reports arrived that Soult's attack had been completely repulsed. The British line had held. The evacuation was safe. His thoughts then turned to the personal. In a rare glimpse of the man behind the uniform, he spoke of his mother, and then of Lady Hester Stanhope, the niece of Prime Minister William Pitt, whom he had loved but never married, sacrificing his personal happiness for his duty. "Stanhope," he murmured to his aide, "remember me to your sister." It was the final confession of a man who had given everything to the service of his country. As the evening deepened, his breathing grew shallow. He looked around the circle of his friends and said simply, "I hope the people of England will be satisfied. I hope my country will do me justice." He died minutes later. Outside, the evacuation continued. Under the cover of darkness, the British regiments marched down to the harbour and boarded the ships. The victory at Elvira had bought them the time they needed. The French, stung by their losses, did not pursue. The Shorncliffe system had passed its ultimate test. It had saved the army from annihilation, but the final indignity was yet to come. The French brought guns up to the heights overlooking the harbour the next morning, firing at the departing transports. In the chaos, there was no time for a formal ceremony. As described in the opening of this film, Moore was buried hastily on the ramparts by his officers. They left him alone in the Spanish soil, the sound of the enemy guns serving as his salute. When the news reached London, the reaction was mixed. The politicians, looking for a scapegoat for the failed campaign, tried to paint Moore as a defeatist. They focused on the retreat, on the drunkenness at Bembibro, on the failure to hold Spain. But the soldiers knew better. The men who had marched with him, who had seen him ride into the fire at Elvira, knew they had been led by a giant. And surprisingly, so did the enemy. When Marshal Soult entered Corunna and discovered where Moore was buried, he did not desecrate the grave. Instead, he ordered a monument to be built over it. The inscription was a tribute from one warrior to another. John Moore, leader of the English armies, slain in battle, 1809. Napoleon himself later wrote, "His talents and firmness saved the British army. He died with glory." The army returned to England in rags, sick and demoralized. To the public, it looked like a disaster. But within the ranks of the survivors, something had changed. The men of the Light Division, the 43rd, 52nd, and 95th, had walked through hell and come out the other side intact. They had proven that a soldier who thinks is superior to a soldier who merely obeys. Moore was dead, but he had left behind a blueprint. He had forged a weapon that was now waiting for a new hand to wield it. That hand would belong to Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. In the spring of 1809, less than 4 months after Moore's death, Sir Arthur Wellesley returned to Lisbon to take command of the British forces. History knows him as the Duke of Wellington, the Iron Duke, the man who defeated Napoleon. But the army he led back into Spain was, in many ways, the army of Sir John Moore. Wellington was a defensive genius, a master of logistics and terrain. He was cold, aristocratic, and famously referred to his soldiers as the scum of the earth, believing that only harsh discipline could keep them in check. This was the antithesis of Moore's philosophy. And yet, Wellington's greatest victories were built upon the foundation of Moore's humanitarian experiment. The Light Division, formed from Moore's Shorncliffe regiments, became the elite spearhead of the Peninsular Army. Under the command of General Robert Black Bob Crawford, a brilliant but erratic disciple of Moore, the Light Division achieved legendary status. They were the eyes and ears of the army. They marched with a speed that baffled the French, famously covering 42 miles in 26 hours to reach the Battle of Talavera. They screened the main army from surprise, dominated the no-man's land between the forces, and consistently bested the French skirmishers who had terrorized Europe for a decade. The French had no answer for them. For years, Napoleon's columns had smashed through the rigid lines of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies. But against the British, they hit a wall. Before the French columns could even reach the British main line, they were tormented by the aimed fire of the 95th Rifles and the flank attacks of the 43rd and 52nd. Moore's thinking soldiers picked off the French officers, disrupted their rhythm, and bled them white before the real battle even began. It is no exaggeration to say that without the Light Division, Wellington's signature tactics, the reverse slope defence, the patient waiting for the perfect moment, would have been impossible. Moore provided the flexibility that allowed Wellington to be static. Sir John Moore's legacy, therefore, is not found in the list of battles he won, but in the nature of the British Army itself. He transformed it from a blunt instrument of state suppression into a professional fighting force. He bridged the gap between the 18th and 19th centuries. He proved that a soldier could be a gentleman, that discipline could exist without cruelty, and that the mind was as important a weapon as the musket. The modern British Army, and indeed modern Special Forces doctrine, traces its lineage back to Shorncliffe Camp. The emphasis on small unit tactics, on individual initiative, and on the buddy system are all direct descendants of Moore's innovations. Today, the tomb of Sir John Moore still stands in the San Carlos Garden in Corunna, overlooking the harbour. It is a quiet, peaceful spot, far removed from the noise of the modern world. But his true monument is not made of stone. It was built on the fields of Waterloo, where the British infantry, steady, disciplined, and lethal, finally broke the power of Napoleon. They stood in squares that did not break, and they fired volleys that did not waver. They were the men of Wellington, yes, but the spirit that animated them, the training that sustained them, and the professionalism that defined them, that belonged to Sir John Moore. The forgotten general was not forgotten by his men. And as long as history remembers the redcoats standing firm against the blue tide of France, the ghost of Corunna stands with them. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.